This is Lisa Schwartz at Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the webinar for our new report on the future of U.S. electricity efficiency programs funded by utility customers. Today, lead author Chuck Goldman and Sean Murphy will present key findings. I also want to recognize our other co-authors, Ian Hoffman, Natalie Mims-Frick, and Greg Leventis. And we gratefully acknowledge our funders at the U.S. Department of Energy and EPA. First, here are just a few housekeeping items. We're recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website. Because of the number of participants, everyone is in listen mode only, so please use the chat box to send us your questions and comments. You can enter your questions at any time. We'll answer as many as we can following the presentation. I'll moderate discussion at the end based on the questions from the chat box. And the recorded webinar slides are posted at the website shown here. And following the webinar, we'll post a recording. Chuck?
Thank you, Lisa. This slide provides an overview, a roadmap for the webinar today, as well as the technical report itself. We are going to summarize our analytical approach for projecting future spending and savings from electricity efficiency programs that can be achieved by program administrators. The projections are based on 3 scenarios, low, medium, and high cases, that reflect different pathways for the evolution of efficiency policies and market dynamics in each state. When we turn to results, we'll present our projections of future spending and savings out to 2030 in the 3 scenarios. We'll provide a national overview first, and then we'll focus on regional spending trends and discuss policies that appear to be primary drivers. We'll then turn to summarizing results for program savings nationally and by region for the 3 scenarios. We have a short section in the report on spending and saving projections for publicly owned utilities and rural co-ops. I won't be presenting those results specifically today. And then finally, in the discussion section, we identify key issues and challenges for future efficiency program administrators and policymakers that contribute to the uncertainty in forecasting future pathways. These issues and challenges include factors that are largely external to program administrators and state regulators, such as broader market forces and conditions and interactions with other policies that may be complementary, as well as factors that are more under the control of program administrators and regulators, such as program implementation issues and regulatory oversight. So this is the 3rd time that we've done this report over the last 10 years, and it's been a little different each time. This study updates the analysis and extends the projections to 2030. In our last report, we went to 2025 for 3 scenarios. We have updated projections in interim years, 2020, 25. And in this report, we focus solely on the electricity sector. It's important to note that we focus primarily on the policy landscape that exists in states today. We think since our last study that policy landscape has changed a lot in a number of states. In some cases, support for efficiency has grown, and in other cases it's retreated and more at risk. And we try to capture that in our analysis of each state. More generally, understanding the potential pathways for the evolution of ratepayer-funded programs and their impact on electricity markets, specifically load growth, infrastructure needs, and the energy service industry that supports these programs, is important to grid operators, utility planners, policymakers, regulators, program administrators, and stakeholders who are interested in the future of efficiency. This slide summarizes at a pretty high level what our analytical approach is. As I noted before, we're doing state-by-state projections in all 50 states out to 2030. In each state, our team reviews the key policy drivers, and we'll go through them in a little bit more detail in another slide or 2. But they are efficiency resource standards, statutes that prescribe all cost-effective efficiency as the goal for program administrators, system benefit charges that are part of statutes and regulations, demand-side management plans, integrated resource plans, utility business model changes that support efficiency. This study, we try to capture the impact of both investor-owned utilities that are program administrators, as well as publicly owned utilities and rural co-ops. as well as in those states that have non-utility administrators, we try to capture those effects as well. And the three scenarios are designed to capture the alternative pathways for the evolution of programs, and we try to capture such effects as the policy implementation efficacy, the actual performance of program administrators over time, and we try to reflect that in the way we model the low and the medium scenario. We focus on broader policy and market drivers. As I noted, there are state-specific scenarios, and one of the key things is we interviewed over 50 folks around the country from public utility commissions, program administrators, efficiency experts, staff in the regional efficiency organizations. And these interviews were designed to help us vet the scenarios, the input assumptions, talk about trends that were going forward. It is important to note that none of the scenarios is intended to capture wholesale shifts in federal policies. In this chart, we provide a conceptual overview of our modeling approach. We project spending and savings for both investor-owned utilities and publicly owned utilities and rural co-ops. It's important to note that we sort of have three kind of time periods. We have, in the historical period, we're focusing on data on spending and savings, and we use that information to sort of calibrate the cost of saved energy in each state as a starting point for the analysis. In the near term, we define a policy period. That policy period, the duration varies by state, and it depends on specific policies in that state. For those periods, we estimate future savings and spending, and we look at those policies. So for example, in the near term, we tend to use DSM plans that are filed by program administrators. We also include specific statutes, the impact of public system benefit charges or efficiency resource standards that specify savings goals over different time periods. In most states, the policy period does not include the entire study period out to 2030. So we define what we call as a post-policy period. And during that time period, we speculate on the future pathways in the three scenarios. And that was a big part of our interviews with folks in different states about whether or not an efficiency resource standard is likely to be extended, if so at what level, what other things might happen in that state, and so on. So deciding which policy and market factors are the most salient influence in the state really requires lots of judgment calls. And the way in which we manage that is by we model the three scenarios to represent alternative pathways. So this next slide gives an example of those key policy drivers and shows the states in which they're applicable. I think we do distinguish between efficiency resource standards, which are statutes that we think folks have to comply with. We also note that there are a number of states that have voluntary savings targets where the Commission asks program administrators to propose savings goals, but they're not necessarily binding from a statutory legal perspective. There's a number of states that require all cost-effective efficiency, and in those states, each state has a process by which they determine savings goals based on that statute. Typically, it involves a market potential study, and then the Commission and the program administrators propose savings goals based on that. You can see from this chart that demand-side management plans are really pretty widespread. Almost every state that has efficiency programs uses those, and they tend to vary from 1 to 3 years. And then increasingly, lots of states have different types of business model approaches that essentially try to either overcome the disincentives to efficiency by the adoption of decoupling mechanisms or lost revenue adjustments, or include efforts to reward exemplary superior performance through different types of incentives for the program administrator. In this study, we also tried to model policy and market constraints that affect the prospects for efficiency in the long term. So some states have adopted policies that effectively constrain the magnitude of available savings or spending. And it's important to account for these constraints in exploring future pathways for efficiency programs. So in this table, we list several policy constraints. So you can see examples of, there are some states that have adopted statutory or regulatory caps on either rate impacts or program spending. Most states control spending either as a way of by approving program budgets and by setting efficiency program charges to match expenditures. But in addition, there are a few states where the legislatures have imposed additional limits by capping the portion of rates or collections that can be dedicated to efficiency. So for example, Pennsylvania has a statutory cap on efficiency and demand response that limits spending to 2% of revenues. There are a whole host of states that have adopted opt-out policies for large commercial and industrial customers that allow eligible customers, typically above a certain threshold of demand or consumption, to stop paying charges for funding efficiency programs. And these opt-out policies may reduce available funding sources for efficiency programs that are not able to, and program administrators may not be able to claim savings from customers that have opted out. So we included information on the amount of retail load that had opted out of participating in programs, and in some cases we projected retail load that was eligible to opt out based upon customer size thresholds that were included in the legislation or PUC decisions, and that's reflected in our scenarios basically going forward in those states that have adopted opt-out programs. In many states, they have policies that allow us to estimate savings in future years. For example, efficiency resource standards or IRPs, where they talk about savings goals. But they don't include information on projected spending. So thus, we developed an analytic method that models and projects future spending for efficiency programs given estimates of future program savings. So specifically, we created a cost of electricity savings function that translates first-year program savings by state into annual program spending, grouping program administrators in states by our 4 census regions. So in this chart, you can see the regression analysis that we did for the 4 regions, and you can see what happens. And this data draws from our cost of state energy database, where we have data from about 115 administrators for 6 or 7 years. And we use this to estimate historic state-specific cost of saved electricity values and that provides the starting value for each state. And then we apply the cost function as depending on state goals. So in some cases, costs we project may escalate as savings goals get more aggressive, and in some cases, costs may ramp down as you move from pilot programs to sort of more full scale. But this is sort of the slope that we see, and you can observe that as you get to 1.5%, we see in most regions sort of an upward trajectory of the cost to save energy based on historic data. So one of the implicit assumptions of this project is that we are using the historic cost patterns to project the future, and if the technologies change a lot, or that's an assumption that we make as a way to derive projections of future spending. So I do want to remind folks that this is a moderated Q&A session that was going to follow the presentation. Please use the chat box for questions, and the report and webinar slides are posted at the Electricity Markets and Policy Group website. So now I'm going to turn toward to the results from this study. So I think it's important to start by sort of where we are historically. This chart presents information for actual spending in 2016 on electricity efficiency programs nationally. There's always a lag in program administrators when they report budgeted amounts to actuals, and so the latest year for which we have almost all the data is 2016. And we estimate that that's actual spending was about $5.8 billion nationally. In this chart, you can see that the top 10 states account for about 61% of total U.S. spending on electricity efficiency program. You can also note that California alone accounts for about 20% of total national spending. So this chart shows the results at a national level for our 3 scenarios over different time periods. We expect spending to increase in all three scenarios between 2016 and 2030. In the medium case, spending is expected to rise to about $8.6 billion in 2030, compared to about $5.8 billion in 2016. That's an increase of about 45%. In our high scenario, we project that spending will increase to about $11 billion, and that would be an increase of about 90% in nominal dollars by 2030. Spending in the low case remains relatively flat, increasing only to $6.8 billion in 2030. And that would actually represent a decrease if we account for the expected effects of inflation and report spending in real dollars. But in this study, we report everything in nominal dollars because that's the way that most people sort of think about this stuff in terms of from a practical sense. In the high scenario, it's important to note that the results are driven by the large potential in the South and the prospects for stronger spending in some of the large states. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the regional results. It's also important to note that we're just showing program administrator spending. So in our cost of saved energy database, we break down participant cost contributions as well as program administrators, and it's roughly about 50-50. So it's important to understand that the total market activity leveraged by these programs is roughly double the actual spending that we observe here. So if that trend continues in the future, spending could range between 13 and 22 billion per year by 2030 in the three scenarios, compared to about 11 billion in 2016. So because we've done this study now 3 times, we thought it was interesting to it'd be useful to sort of compare our last study results from what actually happened. So this chart, it's a busy chart. You can see we compare our projections of future spending in this study with the projections that we made in 2013. And I'd make several points about this slide. First, our current projections for the upside in the high scenario for electricity efficiency programs are significantly lower compared to the 2013 study, about 10.3 billion versus 12 billion if you look at the 2025 time frame. Secondly, our projection of spending in the medium case is slightly higher than the 2013 LBL study. And third, the projected range in spending is much narrower across the 3 scenarios. And that occurs and then maybe the fourth point is that the projected growth in the current study tends to be front-loaded, with increases concentrated in the first 10 years to 2025. And you can see that. So, for example, in the medium scenario, spending increases by about 3.5% to 4% a year between 2016 and 2025, but only about 0.5% per year between 2026 and 2030. And this dynamic of front-loaded growth in spending is attributable to our methodological approach as well as our cautious assessment of efficiency market dynamics beyond the near term. So, for example, efficiency resource standards expire in some states over the next 3 to 7 years, and they typically reach their savings targets prior to the sunset date. In the medium case, we typically take a business-as-usual approach and assume that in states with a binding efficiency resource standard, savings targets will continue at levels that are consistent with the last year. And second, we have higher confidence in our modeling of spending in the near-term policy period, as we can often rely on multi-year DSM plans prepared by program administrators. And in some states, our modeling of the 2025 to 30 period relies on utility integrated resource plans and their characterization of achievable potential. And a number of utilities are projecting reduced savings levels in their IRPs in the later periods of our study from 2025 on. And that impacts our projection of spending in the 2025 to 2030 time frame. And some utilities in their IRPs have projected that the achievable potential for their programs is likely to be lower in the future due to tightening federal efficiency standards and changes in certain end-use markets, market transformation, particularly in the lighting market. Maybe the last point is that you can see in this chart on the sort of dots on the left, we present the actual spending between 2010 and 2015 and 16, and you can see that in 2016 we were between the low and the medium case in terms of actual spending as compared to our scenarios in our 2013 study. So this chart focuses on efficiency spending by region. And you can see that spending varies widely by region today, and regional shares of national spending are expected to shift over time. So in 2016, states in the Northwest and the Northeast accounted for about 64% of spending. In the high scenario, states in the South assume an increasingly prominent role, with spending projected to increase to about $3 billion, in 2030, compared to $1 billion in 2016. It's important to note that the census definition of the South represents about 40% of the national load. And in 2030, the relative share of spending for states in the West and the Northeast decreases to 55%, while states in the South and Midwest account for 45% in that high scenario. So the range in spending in the South is quite large, about $1.3 to $3 billion across the low and the high scenario, and it's really a byproduct of several factors. Only 2 jurisdictions, Maryland and DC, have adopted stringent savings goals to date. A number of states have adopted savings goals in their DSM or IRP plans that are modest relative to the achievable potential, and so that gap is reflected between the low and the high scenario. So there's a lot of potential upside in terms of savings in the region. And there's also significant uncertainty regarding the extent to which policies that may constrain savings, such as large customer opt-out, will spread to other states in the South. In the Midwest, efficiency spending is driven primarily by 4 populous states, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and Minnesota, that have made long-term policy commitments in legislation. The future trajectory of spending in the region will be heavily influenced by policy constraints, opt-out policies, spending caps, as well as long-term resource planning processes that exist in some states like Michigan and Minnesota, and the extent to which utilities are motivated by business model policies to achieve higher savings goals. In the West, California accounts for more than 60% of the spending in the region, and we project that the spending will increase in California compared to 2016 levels, driven primarily by state legislation in California. Lower spending is projected in the Pacific Northwest in all scenarios in 2030 compared to 2016, and that's a function of the region aggressively pursuing efficiency and capturing lots of the savings out to 2025, but folks in the region thinking that effects of market transformation and standards are going to capture lots of the savings, and so the voluntary programs may have slightly lower spending and savings goals in the future. And we expect states in the Southwest, most states, to sustain long-term commitments to efficiency driven by state statutes and favorable utility business models. And in the Northeast, spending is projected to increase under all 3 scenarios, increases to $2.1 to $3.2 billion. And that increased savings is driven by legislation in several states, New York, New Jersey, New Hampshire, which will have increased savings or spending goals. Several of the historic leaders in the region, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Connecticut, are projected to maintain or somewhat reduce spending levels in the later years of the study for utility customer-funded programs due to anticipated saturation of efficiency potential, greater emphasis on complementary strategies such as standards and financing, or state budget constraints. So this next chart gives you a little bit more detail at the state level and shows what's going to happen among the top 10 states. You can see that most of the top 10 states will remain highly ranked. However, we expect some shifts within these jurisdictions as well as several replacements. So for example, in the median case, Washington and Connecticut are replaced by New Jersey and Ohio. In the high case, Florida replaces Ohio. Again, in terms of the top 10 states represent around 60% of total national spending. This chart expresses spending as a percentage of utility revenues, and I'd like to make several points about that. First, retail revenues for the utilities are influenced by their organizational structure and the extent of vertical integration. So thus, spending on electricity efficiency programs represents a higher share of retail revenues in the Northeast, between 3.1% and 5% in 2030, compared to the other regions where it's about 0.5% to 2.4%. And that's because many states in the Northeast have restructured their investor-owned utilities so that they are only distribution utilities and they do not collect commodity costs for customers that have selected retail service providers. Second, efficiency spending as a percent of retail revenues in 2030 is increasing only in the high scenario in most regions except for the West. And third, although there's greater regional balance in absolute dollar spending in 2030, particularly in our high scenarios, the South is projected to lag well behind the West and the Midwest regions in 2030 in all three scenarios in terms of relative spending levels expressed as a percentage of electric utility revenues. So for example, in the South, we're showing spending as a percent of revenues going from about 0.5% to 1.2%, and you can compare that to the Midwest and the West where it goes from between 1 to about 2.5%. So in 2030, efficiency spending in the South as a percentage of electric utility revenues is about 1/4 to 1/2 of the spending levels projected in the West and the Midwest. So even though the absolute spending might increase a fair amount in the South, particularly in the high scenario, as a function of relative to retail revenues, it's still modest. So we're going to turn now to savings, and Sean Murphy is going to take over.
All right, thanks, Chuck. So as with spending, we begin our projections of savings from 2016, where ratepayer-funded efficiency programs saved more than 27 terawatt hours of electricity, nearly 0.75% of that year's retail sales. In our medium scenario, annual savings increase modestly, with savings approaching 30 terawatt hours in 2025 before declining slightly to 28 terawatt hours in 2030. In the high case, savings increase more quickly and end at 38 terawatt hours in 2030, nearly 40% above where they were in 2016. But again, we find savings to be higher in 2025 than in 2030 in our high scenario as well. In our low scenario, savings decrease slowly throughout the next decade, ending at 20 terawatt hours in 2030, roughly 16% below 2016 savings levels. Within these national projections, we find some regional variation. Relative to 2016, savings fall in the West and Midwest in our medium scenario. In the high case, we see significant opportunity in the South. We assume that two large states, Texas and Florida, each reach their achievable savings potentials. As a result, we forecast the South as the largest source of efficiency savings in 2030 in our high case. Rising baselines, the saturation of the lighting market with LEDs, and the cumulative effect of previous program efforts reduces the remaining savings potential across the country. Provisions for large customer opt-out also reduce the market for customer-funded programs. Despite these challenges, we do see programs adapting and evolving to sustain savings. In the Northeast, the expanded commitments of New York and New Jersey lift regional savings over the next decade. In particular, in states where years of previous efforts have produced significant amounts of efficiency savings, sustained savings require that programs and frameworks evolve. From a technological perspective, these efforts could include a focus on deep energy savings through home retrofits and expansion into hard-to-reach markets. From a regulatory and business model perspective, performance incentives, such as that we see in Oklahoma and North Carolina, and energy efficiency resource standards such as we see in Maryland, create conditions for sustained or increased savings. So here we take a look at regional savings trends as a share of retail sales for our medium scenario. With sales incorporated into our forecast, we can more easily compare the impact of programs across regions. In both the Northeast and West, we can see that the impact of rising baselines and saturation of the lighting market after 2025 as savings levels decline from their 2025 peaks. Still, they are the two regions with the greatest savings as a percent of sales. In all years, savings in the Northeast are above 1% of retail sales, well above the Midwest and South, which remain at around 0.8% and 0.4% of sales through 2030 respectively. The absolute savings levels and the absolute savings potential in the South, as indicated in our high scenario, is quite high. But relative to its large sales base, it still falls below other regions, consistent with our conclusions for spending. Now we take a look at annual savings as a percent of sales for the nation as a whole. Our medium case is relatively flat through 2030, ending at 0.7% of sales. In the low case, savings fall to 0.5% of sales, with only 11 states saving 1% or more. In the high case, savings end near 1% of sales in 2030, with 24 states saving 1% of sales or more. In all three scenarios, these forecasts suggest that efficiency will offset a significant portion of load, between 30 and 50%, depending on the scenario. Consequently, the offsets in load suggest that the avoidance or deferral of transmission and distribution is likely to be expected from continued efficiency efforts. Now I'll turn things back to Chuck for our discussion.
Okay, thanks, Sean. We spent a lot of time in this report focusing on spending and savings, but in the course of doing this study and in talking to experts and policymakers around the country, it's very clear that we're sort of at a crossroads in many states for efficiency programs, and doing a study like this has lots of issues and challenges. And so I think we wanted to, in this last section of the paper and in our webinar, I want to talk about some of these sort of broader trends. So I think the first thing to note, and there are some real success stories here. So a changing economy and shifting policy objectives complicate forecasting of future electricity loads. And you can see that when you look at the Energy Information Forecast, where in the most recent EIA projection, load growth is about 0.6% a year to 2030 versus 1.3% a year since 1990. And in the EIA models, that's due to energy intensity decreasing in all economic cycles, as well as due to structural changes in the economy, fuel economy improvements, and success in implementing efficiency policies, whether that be standards, codes, and voluntary programs. And so at the largest macro level, there has been lots of success in implementing efficiency more broadly over the last 2 decades. But clearly, lots of folks are talking about the opportunities for beneficial electrification. And the examples of that include increasing adoptions of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and selected industrial applications. And many states that are interested in those kind of policies are thinking about those in terms of sort of longer-term climate goals. And if those things come to pass, they actually may increase electricity sales, particularly over the longer term to 2050. And if that happens, that might provide different additional opportunities for efficiency policies for these new loads. It's important to recognize as well that we've just had this continued decline in the cost of many electricity supply options. And that poses challenges for cost effectiveness of efficiency portfolios. So we've observed declining costs for gas-fired and renewable generation technologies, and that in combination with relatively low gas prices translates into lower avoided costs and reduced efficiency program benefits. And because programs have to pass cost effectiveness thresholds, that has an impact in terms of what kind of programs you can offer in some states, depending on how they do cost effectiveness screening. And in general, as we talked to program administrators, many of them said to us, they face ongoing challenges in designing cost-effective portfolios. They are being squeezed because the supply side costs are going down, and because there are because of complementary efficiency policies that are taking some of the potential. It's also important to recognize that the evolving generation mix with more focus on variable generation and the changing resource needs of utilities are changing the value proposition that efficiency resources face. And so there's generally, in lots of states, a much greater focus on the time-varying value of efficiency resources. There's more emphasis on controllable loads and what you can do in terms of that, in terms of distribution systems, or in terms of demand response, or reducing loads during peak periods. And there's definitely more interest in bundling the different types of demand-side options in conjunction or in combination, demand response and efficiency, distributed resources, to provide a broader set of grid services. And that's oftentimes how program administrators are increasingly thinking about how their portfolio may need to evolve in the future. And we've captured that to a limited extent in this study. It depends to what extent administrators have captured those things, but there are larger phenomena going on. We've talked about complementary policies, and it's important to recognize their impact. And in recent years at the federal level, there has been more adoption of stringent building codes, which have to be adopted at the state. And there clearly have been progress in terms of federal and state minimum efficiency standards for appliances and end-use equipment, and they've been tightened for many products. And these policies affect utility customer funded programs by essentially raising the baseline against which savings are measured, and thus they influence both the size of the remaining potential that can be harvested from voluntary programs and the mix of technologies that can be targeted. To give a sense of the magnitude of this stuff, ACEEE in its 2016 scorecard report estimates that savings from utility programs averaged about 27 terawatt hours per year between 2013 and 16, and about 21 terawatt hours between 2006 and 2016. For a comparison, at LB&L we have a standards group that does the technical analysis for DOE on standards, and when we do that analysis, we project that the lighting and equipment standards that took effect between 2002 and 2016 saved about 27 terawatt hours per year. So in some sense, historically, efficiency programs and standards have produced comparable levels of savings. But for the next 5 or 10 years, standards that were adopted in the last 5 or 6 years that will take effect during the next 5 years may produce significantly higher savings, something in the range of 40 to 50 terawatt hours per year, depending on what actually happens and transpires. So thus, at a higher level, the increased savings from standards makes it more challenging for administrators of utility programs to obtain cost-effective savings, particularly in later years of our study period. This is a success of efficiency policies more broadly, but it definitely impacts the way in which we think about voluntary programs. It's also important to recognize that efficiency product and service markets are changing, in some cases pretty rapidly. And there's end users that are investing in higher efficiency products and services on their own because of technological innovation. And what you observe is declining cost and higher quality products. You can see the indirect market effects of efficiency programs and standards that may be coming down the pike. And those can also influence the pace of market transformation for products and services. And the example that's often cited is what's happening in the market for general service lamps and the transformation toward the adoption of LED technology. And so you can see the National Electrical Manufacturers Association reports that shipments of LEDs accounted for about 36% of what are called A-line lamps in 2016, compared to less than 1% in 2011. That's a really pretty rapid transformation of the lighting market. And this has implications for efficiency programs, particularly residential programs, because today about 45% of lifetime savings come from residential programs. And with the adoption of higher efficiency products, CFLs and LEDs will become the new savings baseline in years to come in most residential markets. And that means that program administrators are going to have to look for additional technical opportunities for saving electricity to offset the reliance on lighting programs that historically have been quite important in the residential market. It's also important to recognize the role that state leadership plays in driving institutional frameworks for efficiency. So program success depends on customer acceptance and adoption. You need to have good stakeholder processes to get good program designs. Measurement and verification is important. And there are historically disincentives to efficiency under traditional regulation. And so states with efficiency policy goals can consider aligning the utility's financial interests with these goals. And this kind of state leadership, the institutional framework is important in those, particularly in our high case, where states have to make a lot of progress on all of these fronts as they move from their current situation to much more aggressive savings goals. And then we've highlighted earlier what's happening with program portfolios. They're going to need to evolve to capture cost-effective savings. During the time frame of the study, particularly in later years, we expect that program administrators will have to grapple with several significant challenges in developing a cost-effective portfolio. There's going to be a need for new programs. Program administrators will have to look for additional technical opportunities to save electricity to offset their historic reliance on lighting programs. The impact of large customers opting out in those states that allow that. Program administrators in those states are likely to develop program designs that focus more on smaller and mid-sized commercial and industrial customers. Historically, the cost of saving electricity for programs that target these smaller C&I customers has been higher than programs for larger customers, and that's going to put upward pressure on program costs. And so, but for large C&I customers, program administrators may focus more attention on new types of program design, strategic energy management, compliance with ISO 50001 standards to produce savings over time that focus on reducing operating costs and increasing productivity and competitiveness. And so that this notion of having to achieve deeper savings, we list a couple of examples here of how that might happen, and you can see that we think that the value proposition for efficiency is going to have to include and will include more focus on the time varying and locational value. We see in a couple of leading states examples of non-wires alternatives that include competitive procurements to meet distribution system needs, which oftentimes look for bundles of demand-side services and oftentimes include efficiency as a resource option. There also may be increased focus on the integrated delivery of electric and gas efficiency programs. It makes a lot of sense in a number of markets where savings from technologies produce both electric and gas savings. And we can also see examples where administrators are leveraging existing state and local programs and are looking at efforts that combine financing with technical assistance. There are some states and places where financing models are taking off. There's been a rapid uptake in PACE in a number of states in the residential market. There's been some uptake in commercial markets. And there's a lot of interest in using financing as a way to overcome some of the barriers to efficiency. So to conclude, again, we think the portfolio of programs in each state is likely to evolve significantly over the time horizon of this study. There could very well be a potential evolution in drivers and delivery mechanisms that we have not really fully captured in our study. We cite a number of emerging challenges in this study: the increased impact of complementary strategies, decreasing costs for supply-side resource options, adapting the value proposition to reflect changing the utility system needs, which involve integrating variable generation, focusing more on the time-varying value of efficiency, offsetting local distribution system investments. It's important to note that program success depends on customer acceptance and adoption and stakeholder input on program designs. And we have to continue to make progress on advanced methods to measure and verify savings so that we can build confidence in efficiency as a resource. It's important to note that our high scenario assumes that states newer to efficiency provide leadership in defining efficiency policy objectives. They establish clear roles and responsibilities for administrators. They devote sufficient staff resources to oversee efficiency portfolios at regulatory commissions. That's the kind of institutional framework that you need, and we have observed in the states that have been doing efficiency for a long time and have had a lot of success in doing so. And the degree to which program administrators and state regulators address these challenges is likely to heavily influence the longer-term pathway of spending and savings for efficiency programs over the next 5 or 10 years. Finally, I would make a plug for those to look at the report. If you're really having trouble sleeping, take a look at the results in the appendix. In the appendix, we provide a detailed analysis for each state of how we modeled it, and it has a nice summary of the policy drivers and the way we interpret those things going forward, and we hope it provides a resource for folks who are thinking about the future of efficiency in places where they work and live. So with that, I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck and Sean. So there's still time to enter your questions into the chat box, and I'm going to moderate discussion right now with Chuck Goldman and Sean Murphy, and then we also have our other report co-authors on the line. So Chuck, let's start with some of the questions that we've got in from the chat box. Are these program savings actual terawatt-hour savings, or are they predictive projections? We just want some clarification there.
So in the report, for the historic period, 2013 to 2016, these are actual savings as reported by program administrators to their regulatory commissions or to EIA. and then we use those, and then obviously going forward in future years, they are all projections of savings. And as you know, in most states, the way that program administrators report savings is some combination of savings that come from technical reference manuals, technical resource manuals that either have deemed savings or calculated values that are informed by actual impact evaluations where you're using billing analysis and so on. So I guess that's the answer that I can give at this point.
And following up on that, what can you say about actual cost performance? In other words, when you look at spending versus savings. So actuals compared to predictions in your last report. And as referenced, slide 14 shows the actual spending for 2016, and slide 18 shows the actual savings for 2016. So this is about, comparing those two metrics, what you sort of projected in the last report versus what you see when you look at the actual figures, spending and savings for 2016.
I'm going to go back to that slide, if that's okay, just to sort of
Sure.
see specifically what we're talking about.
So I think 14 and 18.
Well, for slide 14 and slide 18, Lisa, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think this question is getting to cost performance, where you look at both, both figures simultaneously, both the spending and the savings.
So the challenge is that we're doing that sort of at a state-by-state level, and we're summarizing this nationally. And so, as everybody knows who works in this space, there can be lots of variation across states and lots of trends over time. But that regression analysis that I showed you captures the historic data on the cost to save energy, and it does that as a function of as utilities or program administrators increase, what happens as savings goals increase, what happens to the first year costs. So
why don't we show that slide, Chuck, slide 9.
Okay, we'll go back and do that. Let's see. Okay, so this is a slide that's essentially combining 6 or 7 years of historic data on first-year program costs and savings as reported by program administrators to their regulators. These are all investor-owned utilities in this slide. And we're trying to capture what happens over time as those program administrators may or may not be ramping up their programs. What happens to the first-year program costs? And there's lots of scatter that's not shown in this picture. We're showing you the regression results. But you can get a very nice regression fit of this data for each region. And what you can see generally is that costs start to go up when you get to between 1 and 1.5% of retail sales historically. The cost to save energy starts to increase. And you can also see that costs go down as you're going from very early pilot programs where you have lots of administrative costs and startup costs to as you then ramp up your programs and you're able to provide incentives or other kind of things, and your savings, your fixed costs get amortized over a much larger base of participants. That's what happens as sort of cost of energy goes down.
All right, let's move on to some of the specific findings. So you talk in the report about a shift potentially in the future to for the commercial and industrial sectors to smaller customers because of the opt-out provisions in some states. So the question is, do you think that shift to smaller commercial and industrial customers will mean lighting programs, or instead might that lead to new program designs with demand management and integrating across gas and electric, for example?
Well, that's a great question. I think we should first note that there's something on the order of 12 to 15 states that have C&I opt-out policies in place today. So we're not talking about every state, and we're talking about a subset of states, clearly. I don't think we really. I think in the near term we can expect folks to do more lighting programs and HVAC, but I think in the longer term we're going to see different bundles of programs, of technologies that people will try to offer to appeal to small and commercial customers. It could definitely include more controls. It could definitely include more HVAC type stuff. But again, it will be a question of these are historically hard markets to reach. So we're going to need to see some innovation. Particularly, the small commercial market, certainly a hard market to reach. Medium, maybe less so.
All right, in your interviews with utilities and other program administrators, with state regulators, energy efficiency experts, did you find, what did you find when they raised things like electric vehicle consumption and electrification more broadly, for example, for space and water heating and industrial loads? How did they couch that? Did they suggest, talking about removing loads for that when you're trying to look at the future for meeting cost and savings goals?
I think we're at the very beginning of conversations about beneficial electrification and its potential impacts. I think the conversation may vary a little bit depending on the technology. So electric vehicles clearly are a new load, and the market penetration is really quite low in most states, so it's not necessarily a huge issue today, but I think it's something that people certainly are thinking about in the next 10 years. And people are thinking about how to make sure that we think about efficiency options in terms of EV charging infrastructure. As you move toward heat pumps and industrial applications, I think you start to get into questions about fuel switching and fuel substitution policies that states have and what they're going to do. And that I think is a larger sort of regulatory question that states are going to have to work through in terms of some states are thinking about rethinking their policies about fuel substitution and so on. But we didn't get into the specifics of that. We were just trying to highlight the fact that this potentially, at least in the longer time frame, this could change electric load projections in the 2030, 2050 time frame. That's beyond our study period, but it's something to be thinking about.
And another trend that listeners have raised in the chat box is declining prices for gas and renewable energy generation. And so the questions naturally arise about our conventional metrics for cost effectiveness, for efficiency, particularly the energy related impacts and the dollars avoided. Did you find in your interviews discussion about non-energy impacts like air pollution impacts, and how do you think that might affect the future energy efficiency program design and implementation?
So every state has cost-effectiveness screening policies that they use, that commissions adopt, that provide guidance to their program administrators about the efficiency portfolio. And in general, it's pretty clear that states that tend to use a societal perspective on efficiency program screening, or tend to use, take that perspective, oftentimes find that they can support and justify a broader set of programs. So this notion, and oftentimes in that perspective, they start to include non-energy benefits or benefits from other fuels or things like that. And so, it's clear that there's a direct linkage between the ways in which you think about cost-effectiveness screening and what that says about the kind of voluntary programs that you're willing to offer to your customers.
All right, and this is a question that we get, often when we're talking about the cost of saving electricity, or in this case where we're projecting future spending and savings. Maybe just to clarify, when we talk about energy savings, how much of that is actually measured energy savings rather than deemed savings? You mentioned technical reference manuals, so just as a clarification, it'd be helpful, I think, for listeners.
I suspect that most of the savings that are reported by administrators come from values that are used in their technical reference manuals. And those are primarily different types of deemed savings values that are informed by impact evaluations. So I'm not sure I can, I don't know what it means to exactly measure energy savings because the challenge in efficiency programs is that you can measure changes in customer bills using utility bills, but in many markets, the way in which we measure savings or project savings is we're comparing the new technology to either market baseline or codes and standards, and that's not the same thing as the customer's utility bill. So in some sense, we oftentimes take a conservative approach to estimating savings because we're not using the customer's existing utility bill or technology as the basis for estimating savings.
All right, thanks. And let's talk about how these projections can be used both by utilities and state regulators. Let's start with Chuck, if you were a utility, managing the utilities portfolio of energy efficiency programs, and you read this report cover to cover, how might you position yourself to be successful in the future? Particularly, maybe take two cases. One, where you're a state, that's maybe has less mature programs, haven't been in this business for a long time, versus a state that has quite mature programs. So how would you try to use this information as a state or other program administrator?
Well, I think you can use this report at several levels. One, you can think about which policy drivers and or market constraints will likely impact sort of what you're able to get from efficiency down the road. You can also use this report to get some sense of sort of what efficiency costs, what the variation is in terms of what program administrators are reporting in terms of cost to save energy. You can use this report in conjunction with our cost of saved energy report, which provides that information for 50 or 60 different types of programs, so you can get a sense of what that portfolio looks like. I also think that the report provides some insights that it's not clear that we're going to be able to keep doing business the way we've been doing it the last 5 or 10 years for the next 10 or 15 years. I don't think we know, we try to highlight some of the things that we think are changing, and I think those changes may impact the way in which we think about a lot of this stuff. So, I mean, historically, the classic way, if you're doing an integrated resource plan or an efficiency resource standard, is, all savings are valued the same in an efficiency resource standard, irrespective of when they occur and the timing of them or the location. And I think increasingly we're going to see much more emphasis on people thinking about the time varying and locational value, and that's going to affect the way in which we design programs. They'll be more targeted. They may focus more on measures that are more valuable during those periods when the avoided costs are higher, and so on. But our report is sort of at a somewhat higher level and more general than that. There's all these things going on beneath that stuff that people are starting to think about and reflect, and they have impact the way in which they're thinking about their portfolio.
All right, we have an alert reader of our report looking in the appendix, so bravo. So, no, this is good. This is a question about California and the notion that potentially there's some negative correlation between spending and savings for that state. And so the question is, do you tie that to, the third-party implementation-related changes that are starting to happen in California, showing, some potentially, more spending and less savings?
So in our report, we talk about, California. Well, make 2 points. One, the historic data, 2016 and past, does not necessarily reflect third-party implementation-related changes. Those are things that are on the horizon, which will be implemented the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, which could have very significant impacts. And that's part of the way we model them in the low scenario. But what if this transition to the utilities competitively bidding out 25 to 60% of their portfolio doesn't go that well, or takes longer, or turns out that the prices are higher, or whatever? I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to play out going forward in the near term in California. What I would say about the historic period in California is that the California Commission has been quite aggressive in thinking about savings and baselines, so and net to gross adjustment. So the Commission in California has taken a pretty has been, the savings per measure keep going down in California because either the market baselines are going up, or because of the evaluations that are done in California about impact evaluation or net to gross ratios. So when you see, that's one of the things that's happening in California. Savings it's getting tougher. There's pretty rigorous M&V in California on savings, and that's affecting the relationship between spending and savings. The other thing I would point out in California is there's a pretty strong emphasis and push to promote hard-to-reach markets, low-income customers, small business customers. So again, California utilities are being directed by policymakers to keep up their spending efforts in targeting and reaching hard-to-reach customers, and that oftentimes results in higher costs per savings achieved.
All right, you've made a lot of strides for the kind of analysis that you did in this current study for publicly owned utilities and rural electric co-ops. So maybe, prompting this background slide 40, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the projected spending and energy savings for these utilities and how spending and savings are expected to change in 2030, because the analysis you did was much more detailed this time.
So to recap, in the 2013 study, we basically just made assumptions. We just said what's going to happen in the future for public utilities in the low scenario is savings will get to be 0.2%, and the medium will be 0.5%, and the high will be 0.7% of retail sales. And we did that based on what was happening with investor-owned utilities. It wasn't state-specific. It was just based on sort of they're going to follow national trends. And in this study, we decided that we could do better than that, or we should try to do better than that. And so what we did is we collected all the EIA data on historic spending and savings for public utilities, and we did that at a state level. And then we also tried to say what fraction of public utilities and rural co-ops actually had efficiency programs. And so in the analysis, we tried to account for those that did versus those that didn't. And in the high scenario, we assumed that those that didn't have programs today would start some programs over the next 5 or 10 years. We also noted that the spending is really concentrated in 5 or 6 states. In some cases, that's because those states either have large public utility loads relative to their overall load, or because they have explicit state policies that cover public utilities and rural co-ops. And so we again tried to be very explicit in those cases where an EERS or something else applies to a publicly owned utility or rural co-op. We tried to capture that in the state modeling. And then we tried to sum that all up in this sort of summary chart nationally. And I would say that we could clearly do better than we've done here in terms of projecting the future for rural co-ops and munis. We don't have we didn't have a chance. We didn't really, spend a ton of time vetting these results with those folks in a lot of detail. Partly because there's a couple thousand public utilities and rural co-ops. It's much harder to do it in terms of just resources. But we did make an effort, and I think I would say that the analysis is better and improved than the one we did in 2013, and I would say it could still be improved.
All right, I'm going to go back one slide to 39 here, and this is again just as in sort of the additional slides that we had that you didn't explicitly cover in your presentation. So what were the primary policy drivers in the medium case in 2030?
So in reality, what we've done, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say in 2020 as well. So nearer term 2020, and then as you went further into 2030.
Okay. So what happens in practice is that states are influenced by multiple policy drivers, most states. And that's what we try to reflect in the modeling. But we also tried to make a first cut at saying, well, is there really a primary policy driver in states? And what decision rules would you use to do that? So for example, oftentimes, if you have an efficiency resource standard that's binding, with a binding savings target, that influences what's going to happen. So DSM plans have to comply with that and so on. So we tried to think through for each state what was the primary policy driver. And then we tried to associate the savings in these different time periods with that driver for that state. So for example, in lots of states that don't have efficiency resource standards, that are oftentimes maybe newer to efficiency, the utility business model is sort of a driving factor. We see cases where utilities are going beyond efficiency resource standard targets, or they're being more aggressive, or they're in their IRP plan, they talk about this stuff. And so that's the process that we used. And you can see that in 2020, the efficiency resource standards, because are roughly account for, roughly about a third of the spending, maybe are reflected about 40% of the spending for business model stuff. What happens between 2020 and 2030 is we don't know how long the business models last. So they're more uncertain about how long those policies will be carried forward. And that's why it ended up that we could tie less of the spending to that policy, because there was more uncertainty about what a state might do in that area. And then I think the other thing I would say is that what you see in 2030 is that there are a few states that have all cost-effective efficiency policies, and those states are ramping up. And so in relative terms, they account for a greater share of the total spending.
All right, and I think just one clarification that comes up often when we're discussing these kinds of studies. How do you handle, or do you handle at all, probabilities? For example, if I'm trying to understand, if I'm a regulator or a utility, I'm trying to understand, is it going to be the medium scenario or the high or the low? I mean, what do I do about that? And how do you view sort of probabilities that it might be one or the other?
We do not do an explicit probability analysis. You can see from the slide where we showed you what happened between our 2013 study and the actual results, that we were sort of between the low and the medium. I think that the medium scenario is we hope, is somewhat more, in terms of probability. If you had to put probabilities on this stuff, we think it's more likely than the other two scenarios. And I wouldn't put any specific numbers on them or percentages.
All right.
You just can't do that. I mean, the point of the exercise, I think, is not about probability. The point is to think about what are the factors that are driving results, what are the trends that are going on in states, what are the things that are influencing these drivers, and to think about it, to use this kind of exercise to think about strategically the things that are influencing your voluntary efficiency programs and what else is going on in your state in terms of either other complementary efficiency strategies and or other big factors that are influencing how you're thinking about this resource going forward.
All right, I think that's a good place to end it. Chuck, unless there is anything else that you wanted to say about the study.
Just want to say it was a real team effort. We got incredible value from our colleagues at LBL, as well as all the people we talked to around the country who provided input on our scenarios, as well as reviewed the study before it came out in final form. So I want to thank all the folks in the efficiency community and policymakers who gave us their time.
All right, thanks Chuck and Sean and our other co-authors, and we will wrap it there. Thank you.